The evening rush at the lakeside restaurant had just begun. Waiters hurried between tables, balancing trays of food and glasses filled with sparkling drinks. Soft chatter filled the air, mixed with the clinking of silverware and the occasional laugh from one of the regular customers. Among all the movement, one person worked quietly, almost invisible in the crowd, a young waitress named Emily Carter. Emily moved with calm precision, her steps light and practiced. She greeted every table with a gentle smile that seemed both warm and distant, like someone used to being polite but not seen. Her co-workers often said she had the patience of an angel. No matter how busy the night got or how difficult a customer became, Emily never lost her calm. But behind that calmness, few knew there was a story that had changed the course of her life. She had once dreamed of something entirely different. Long before she began carrying trays, Emily had lived for the piano. When she was a little girl, her father bought her a second-hand upright piano that barely held its tune. The keys were yellowed and chipped, but to Emily it was a treasure. Every afternoon after school, she'd sit for hours teaching herself to play by ear. By 16, she was playing complex pieces from memory. Her dream was simple: to perform on a stage one day under real lights before people who loved music as much as she did. That dream started to come true when she earned a place at the city's music conservatory. She studied classical piano, and her teachers said she had a rare gift, not just technical skill, but emotion that pulled people in. For a time, it seemed like her path was set, but life has a way of changing plans without asking permission. When her mother fell seriously ill, the hospital bills began to pile up. Emily tried to balance classes and part-time jobs, but the money was never enough. She started missing lectures, then lessons. The stress became too much. After a long talk with her mother, she made a heartbreaking choice. She would leave school and work full-time. Her professors tried to convince her to stay, but Emily shook her head. "Family comes first," she said softly, knowing it meant letting go of everything she had dreamed of. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Emily had worked at the restaurant, saving every dollar she could. Her mother's health had stabilized somewhat, though the medical costs were still heavy. The piano she loved now sat in their small apartment, covered with a sheet, untouched except for the occasional evening when Emily's hands couldn't resist the keys. But even then, she played quietly so the neighbors wouldn't hear, as if she was afraid her old dream might come back to remind her what she'd lost. The restaurant was her world now. She came early, stayed late, and never complained. Her co-workers admired her dedication, but they also noticed she kept to herself. During breaks, others would chat and scroll through their phones, while Emily often stood by the window, sipping coffee, lost in thought. That Friday evening began like any other. The sun was setting, casting golden light through the restaurant's tall windows. Couples filled the corner tables. A family celebrated a birthday near the fireplace, and a group of businessmen took over the large round table near the piano. That piano sat in the corner, polished but unused tonight. The regular pianist had called in sick, and though the manager had tried to find a replacement, no one was available on such short notice. "Guess we'll have to make do without music tonight," the manager sighed, adjusting his tie. Emily nodded, carrying a tray of wine glasses to the businessmen's table. They were loud, clearly in high spirits, their laughter echoing through the room. As she approached, one of them, a tall man in a tailored suit with silver hair and a confident air, glanced up. Here's our waitress," he said, his tone smooth but slightly dismissive. "Be careful with that wine, it's worth more than your shift." His friends chuckled. Emily kept her smile steady. She'd learned long ago that some customers just wanted attention, and the easiest way to handle them was with quiet professionalism. "Of course, sir," she said politely, pouring the wine without spilling a drop. The man's name, as she'd overheard earlier, was Charles Bennett, a successful investor and one of those regulars who treated dinner like a performance. Every gesture he made seemed rehearsed for an invisible audience. He spoke loudly as if to make sure everyone nearby knew who he was. Emily had served him before. He tipped well, but he also liked to make jokes at the staff's expense. Tonight, he was in an especially boastful mood. He bragged about a business deal, then about his car, then about a recent charity gala. His companions laughed and nodded, clearly used to his stories. Emily moved around the table quietly, placing plates of food with care, her mind elsewhere. When she turned to leave, one of the men at the table asked, "Isn't there usually a pianist here?" "There is," Charles replied, swirling his wine, "but apparently not tonight." He looked toward the empty piano, then smirked. "Shame. A restaurant like this should never be without music." Another man teased, "Maybe one of us should give it a try." Charles laughed. "I'd pay to see that." Then glancing toward Emily, who was clearing plates nearby, he added with a grin, "Or maybe our lovely waitress can play us something." "You look like you could use a little spotlight, dear." The table erupted in light laughter. Emily froze for just a moment, unsure how to respond. She wasn't offended, not exactly, but the attention made her uncomfortable. She smiled politely, shaking her head. "I'm afraid I don't know how, sir." "Oh, come on," Charles said, clearly amused. "Everyone knows a little tune. Chopsticks, maybe?" His friends laughed again. The comment stung more than Emily expected. It wasn't just the words, but the tone, the easy arrogance of someone who had never been underestimated in his life. She took a slow breath, placing the plates onto her tray. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I'm just here to serve tonight." The manager, watching from the bar, frowned slightly. He knew Emily's story. She had told him once, on a quiet afternoon, how she used to study music. He thought of speaking up, but decided against it. The last thing Emily needed was more unwanted attention. As the night went on, the restaurant grew busier. Emily focused on her work, pushing the awkward moment from her mind. But she couldn't help glancing at the piano from time to time. It stood there, silent and gleaming under the warm lights, like an old friend waiting to be remembered. When the dinner crowd began to thin, she took a moment to breathe near the service counter. One of her coworkers, a young waiter named Daniel, approached with a grin. "You handled that table well," he said. "I'd have lost my temper with that guy." Emily smiled faintly. "It's easier not to take it personally." Still, when she looked toward the businessman's table, she saw Charles holding court again, his voice rising over the hum of the room. "Talent," he was saying, "is overrated. Anyone can claim they're gifted, but without status, it doesn't matter. That's how the world works." Emily looked down at her hands, the same hands that once played Chopin and Debussy, that once dreamed of concert halls and applause. She flexed her fingers slightly, feeling a familiar ache, not physical but emotional. She thought of her piano at home, hidden under its dusty cover. As the night drew to a close, Charles raised his glass for a final toast. His friends clapped him on the back, laughing as the staff began clearing tables. Emily moved carefully, collecting glasses, her mind drifting. The restaurant's lights dimmed slightly, reflecting softly off the piano's surface. For a brief second, she imagined herself sitting there again, her fingers finding the notes she hadn't touched in so long. Then the moment passed. She turned back to her work. When the last customers left and the chairs were stacked for cleaning, Emily hung up her apron and stepped outside. The city air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and walked toward the bus stop. The streets shimmered with reflections from streetlights, and the sound of distant traffic mixed with the faint echo of music from a nearby bar. She paused for a moment, staring at her reflection in a darkened shop window. She hardly recognized herself, the tired eyes, the faint lines of worry that hadn't been there a few years ago. Somewhere beneath that quiet exterior was still the girl who had believed in music. As she waited for the bus, she thought about the man's words, his mocking tone, the laughter at the table. A small spark of pride lit inside her, not anger, but something stronger. She whispered softly to herself, "Maybe one day they'll see." And though she didn't know it yet, that day would come much sooner than anyone, including Emily herself, could ever imagine. The next evening came faster than Emily expected. After closing up the night before, she'd gone home exhausted but unable to sleep. Her mind kept circling back to the moment Charles Bennett had pointed at her and joked about the piano. It wasn't anger that kept her awake. It was something deeper, like a mix of embarrassment and the sting of being underestimated. She had spent years trying to forget that part of herself, trying to accept that life had pushed her in another direction. But when he'd laughed, it felt like every part of her that once belonged to music woke up again. Even if just for a few seconds, she could almost hear the keys under her fingers, the sound of the chords she used to play in her small apartment at night. When she got up the next morning, her eyes felt heavy, but her thoughts were sharper than usual. She made coffee, stood by the window of her small kitchen, and looked out at the gray Chicago skyline. The piano sat across the room, covered as always. The white sheet looked like a quiet reminder of what she had given up. She walked over, hesitated, then slowly lifted the cloth. Dust floated up in the sunlight. The keys looked worn, their edges faded. Her hand hovered over them for a long time. Then, almost without thinking, she pressed one key. The sound was off tune but warm. She pressed another, then another. Her fingers began to move faster, remembering what they once knew. For a few minutes, she forgot the world around her. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She wasn't tired or worried. She was the girl who once dreamed of stages and applause. When the song ended, the room fell silent again. Emily let out a shaky breath and sat there quietly. Her heart felt lighter somehow, but she quickly pulled the sheet back over the piano. Reality had a way of finding her, no matter how far she tried to run from it. By late afternoon, she was back at the restaurant, tying her apron and greeting her co-workers. The weekend crowd was already filling the tables. The air smelled of roasted garlic and grilled salmon, the sounds of laughter and conversation blending with the clatter of dishes. It was just another night at Lakeside, except tonight, Charles Bennett was back. She saw him the moment he walked in, surrounded by two men and a woman dressed elegantly in red. His presence filled the room before he even reached his table. The host led them to the same corner spot near the piano. Emily's stomach tightened slightly. She hoped someone else would get assigned to his table, but luck had other plans. "Emily, can you take care of table 9 again?" the manager asked. "They requested you by name." She blinked in surprise. Requested her? That almost never happened. "Of course," she said quietly, though her voice carried a note of hesitation. When she approached the table, Charles smiled as if greeting an old friend. "Ah, there she is," he said. "The most graceful waitress in Chicago. We were hoping you'd serve us again." Emily returned a polite smile. "Good evening, sir." "Welcome back." His guests laughed lightly, and the woman beside him leaned closer. "You really have fans here, don't you?" she said playfully. Charles chuckled, glancing toward the empty piano again. "Well, I was hoping there'd be music tonight. Seems this place has given up on class." "The pianist canceled again," Emily replied softly, setting their menus down. Charles leaned back in his chair, pretending to sigh. What a shame. A restaurant like this deserves live music. Then, with a glint of mischief in his eyes, he added, "Unless, of course, our waitress has been practicing for her big debut." The table chuckled. Emily kept her tone steady. "I don't play, sir," she said again, though something inside her wanted to add, "not anymore." But Charles wasn't ready to let it go. "You know," he said, turning to his guests, "I've been thinking about that. It takes confidence to perform in public. And confidence, my friends, is what separates ordinary people from the exceptional." He glanced back at Emily. "You don't strike me as someone who takes chances." Emily looked at him, not with anger, but quiet curiosity. "Maybe not," she said. "But sometimes it's wiser not to gamble what you can't afford to lose." Her calmness seemed to surprise him. He raised an eyebrow, then smiled faintly. "Touché," he said. "I like that answer." She excused herself to fetch their drinks, leaving the table momentarily. As she walked to the bar, her coworker Daniel whispered, "You're handling him better than I ever could." Emily smiled faintly. "He just likes attention." "Yeah," Daniel said, glancing toward the corner. "But he's watching you like you just challenged him to a game." When she returned to the table, Charles was in mid-story, talking about a charity event he'd attended where a famous pianist had played. "It was breathtaking," he said. "Real talent always makes people stop and listen. You can't fake that." Then he looked at Emily again, clearly setting up another moment. Though, of course, true talent is rare. Something about the way he said it made Emily's chest tighten. She didn't know why he was so fixated on her. Maybe because she hadn't flattered him the way most people did. Maybe because her quietness unsettled him. But she met his gaze evenly this time. "Talent isn't rare," she said softly. "Sometimes people just don't get the chance to show it." There was a brief silence at the table. The woman in red tilted her head slightly, studying Emily with interest. Charles smiled again, but this time it wasn't quite as confident. "Is that so?" he asked. "Yes," Emily said, her voice steady now. "Not everyone starts at the same place. Some people have to stop before they can even begin. Charles chuckled under his breath. A philosopher, too, he said. Tell you what, I like your spirit. But if you ever do get that chance, he tapped the piano key symbol engraved on the menu cover. You'd better be ready to prove it. The guests laughed again, but the woman at the table didn't join in. Instead, she smiled kindly at Emily. He likes to tease, she said gently. Don't let him get under your skin. Emily smiled back. I won't, she replied, though her heart was beating faster than before. The rest of the dinner passed without incident. Charles and his guests ate, drank, and continued their lively conversation. But as the night went on, more and more customers began asking the same question. Where's the pianist? The restaurant felt emptier without music. The clinking of plates and chatter filled the air, but it lacked warmth. Emily noticed it too. The piano sat under the soft light near the window, quiet and almost forgotten. As she refilled Charles's glass near the end of the meal, one of his friends pointed toward the piano. You know, he said, this place needs someone to fix that silence. It's almost sad seeing that instrument just sit there. Charles grinned, clearly sensing an opportunity. You're right, he said. Maybe we can change that. He turned toward Emily. What do you say? You sit there for one song, and if you can make this room listen, I'll give you $500. The offer came out of nowhere. The nearby tables turned their heads. A few people had overheard. Emily froze. I can't, she said immediately. I'm just a waitress. Charles leaned forward, clearly enjoying himself. Oh, come now. It's just a little fun. No harm in trying. Unless, of course, you really can't play. His tone was playful, but the challenge underneath it was sharp. The restaurant had gone unusually quiet. Emily felt every pair of eyes on her. The woman in red looked uncomfortable. Charles, that's not fair, she said softly, but Charles just shrugged. I'm just offering a chance. $500 for one song, that's all. Emily stood there, her hands gripping the tray against her side. She could feel her pulse racing. She wanted to walk away, to ignore him, but something inside her stirred, a quiet, burning mix of pride and defiance. The manager stepped forward then, clearly sensing the tension. Mr. Bennett, please, he said gently. Our staff aren't performers. Let's not make them uncomfortable. Charles smiled thinly. Just trying to make the evening memorable. Emily exhaled slowly, nodding toward the manager. It's all right, she said quietly. He's just being playful. Then she turned back to Charles, meeting his gaze directly for the first time all night. Maybe one day, she said softly. Not tonight. Charles studied her for a moment, clearly intrigued by her calm. One day then, he said finally, lifting his glass in a half-toast. I'll hold you to that. She gave a small nod, then turned to leave, her heart pounding harder than ever. The moment passed, conversation resumed, and laughter returned to the table. But something had changed in the air. An invisible line had been drawn. By the time the restaurant closed, Emily was quieter than usual. She moved through the motions automatically, wiping tables, stacking glasses, folding napkins. Daniel noticed and asked if she was all right. I'm fine, she said. But inside, her mind was spinning. When she got home that night, she didn't even take off her coat. She walked straight to the piano, pulled off the sheet, and sat down. The keys looked back at her, waiting. Her fingers trembled slightly, but then they began to move, then softly at first, then faster. Notes filled the room, echoing against the walls, building into something powerful and alive. She closed her eyes and played as if the entire restaurant could hear her. When she stopped, she whispered to herself, almost as if answering the challenge that still lingered in her mind. Maybe one day, she said again. But even she didn't realize. That day was much closer than she thought. The next few days at the restaurant passed quietly, but something had shifted inside Emily. She couldn't stop thinking about that night, about Charles's challenge, about the way the whole restaurant had gone silent, waiting for her answer. She told herself it didn't matter, that she had done the right thing by walking away. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the voice that whispered, you could have shown them. Every morning before work, she found herself sitting at her old piano. At first, she just played short pieces, soft melodies she remembered from her music school days. But soon her sessions grew longer. Her hands were stiff at first, but each day they loosened up a little more. The music came back like muscle memory, flooding her mind with feelings she thought she had buried for good. One evening, as she was practicing quietly, her mother came out of her room, holding a cup of tea. She leaned against the doorway, smiling. "I haven't heard that in a long time," she said. Emily turned, a little embarrassed. "I was just passing the time." Her mother walked over slowly and sat beside her. "You're still just as good as you were before," she said. "Maybe even better." Emily shook her head. "I'm out of practice. And besides, I'm not that person anymore." Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You might think that," she said softly, "but I don't. Some things don't leave you, no matter how much time passes." They sat there for a while, neither of them speaking. The soft hum of the city came through the window, blending with the faint sound of the last note fading from the piano. By the end of that week, Emily felt more alive than she had in years. She didn't tell anyone she was practicing again, not even her coworkers. It was her secret, her way of reclaiming a small piece of herself. But fate has a strange way of finding people right, when they start to believe they've escaped. Attention. It was a Friday evening again when Charles Bennett returned. The restaurant was packed. Every table was full and the air was alive with the sound of chatter and clinking glasses. The lights glowed warmly, and the city's reflection shimmered in the large front windows. Emily noticed him the moment he walked in. This time he wasn't just accompanied by his usual circle of business friends. He was joined by two other men, one older with silver hair and a calm presence, and the other carrying a small camera bag. They were clearly important guests. The manager personally greeted them at the door and led them to the same corner table by the piano. As fate would have it, Emily was again assigned to serve them. She approached their table, keeping her tone polite and professional. "Good evening, gentlemen." "Welcome back," Charles smiled. "Ah, Miss Carter," he said, his voice warm but teasing. "You remember us?" "Of course," Emily said, setting down the menus. "Would you like to start with drinks?" "Please," Charles said. "And bring your best smile, too. We're celebrating tonight." Emily nodded and left to fetch the drinks. From behind the counter, she could see the group laughing and talking animatedly. The man with the silver hair seemed especially interested in the piano. He leaned toward it, ran a finger along the polished edge, and said something that made Charles grin. When she returned with their drinks, Charles looked up at her and said, "You know, we were just talking about you." Emily blinked in surprise. "About me?" "Yes," he said, clearly enjoying the reaction. "I was telling my friends here about the night you refused to play. They didn't believe me. They think anyone who looks like they have music in them must have at least one song to share." The older man chuckled softly. "He's exaggerating," he said kindly. "But I do happen to love piano music. I used to own a small concert hall. That instrument over there is beautiful. Shame no one's playing it tonight." Emily smiled politely. "Our regular pianist is still unwell, sir." "What a coincidence," Charles said, leaning back. "Seems every time I come here the music disappears. Maybe it's a sign." She felt her stomach tighten again, the same as before. "I'm sure it's just bad timing," she said lightly. Charles smiled in that way that told everyone he wasn't done yet. "Or maybe," he said slowly, "it's waiting for the right person." His friend looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Charles gestured toward Emily. "Our dear waitress here has a hidden talent. She used to study music, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't that right?" Emily froze. Her eyes flicked toward him in shock. How could he possibly know that? She hadn't told anyone but her manager, and even that was in confidence. Charles caught her look and grinned. "Don't be surprised. I asked around last time. A man like me has ways of learning things." The words sent a wave of heat up her neck. She wasn't angry, not exactly, but she felt exposed. The entire restaurant didn't need to know about her past. "I'd rather not talk about that," she said quietly, keeping her voice calm. "Fair enough," Charles said smoothly. "But tell me one thing, do you still play?" There it was, the question she'd been avoiding for years. The one that carried both pride and pain. She met his eyes for a brief moment. "Sometimes," she said. "At home," the older man smiled warmly. "That's wonderful," he said. "Music should never be forgotten." Charles's grin returned, sharper this time. "Then maybe tonight's the night to share it again. You see my friend here," he gestured toward the older man, "is organizing a charity gala next month. He's looking for local performers. What better audition than right now?" Emily laughed softly, though it sounded nervous. "I think I'll pass, sir. I'm not a performer anymore. Ah, Charles said, there it is again. The fear of failure. Her breath caught slightly. He leaned forward. You know, people like you fascinate me. You have talent, but you hide it behind excuses. Meanwhile, others out there take chances even if they fall flat. That's why some succeed and others serve. The words hit harder than she expected. Around the table, his friends exchanged uneasy glances. Even the older man frowned slightly as if Charles had gone too far. Emily didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, her hands tightening around the tray. Then quietly she said, "Maybe success isn't always about being seen." The older man nodded approvingly. Well said. Charles smiled again, but his tone had lost its playful edge. Still, he said, words are easy. Proving them is harder. I'll make the same offer I did last time. $500 one song. The cameraman laughed lightly. Is this another one of your bets, Charles? You could call it that, Charles said. But it's really about truth. Can she back up what she says? Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to walk away again. That would have been the safe choice. But something was different this time. The restaurant had grown quieter, and a few nearby tables had started watching the exchange. She could feel it, that tension between humiliation and courage. Before she could reply, her manager appeared beside her, his tone calm but firm. "Mr. Bennett, please," he said. "Let's not turn dinner into a spectacle." Charles raised his hands in mock surrender. No offense intended. Just friendly fun. Emily looked at her manager, then back at the piano. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from something else. A rising determination she couldn't fully explain. She set down her tray and spoke softly. "What if I did play?" Charles's smile returned instantly. "Then I'd finally get to hear whether you're as good as you claim." She took a slow breath. "I never claimed anything," she said. "But maybe you'll finally stop asking." The restaurant went still. Even the waiters paused, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Emily's manager looked at her in surprise. "Are you sure?" She nodded once. "It's all right." Charles leaned back, satisfied. "Now this, my friends, is what I call entertainment." Emily walked toward the piano slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The lights above her glowed softly, reflecting off the polished wood. She ran her hand across the keys, feeling their cool surface. Her fingers trembled slightly. She hadn't played in public in years, not since her last recital before she left school. She took a deep breath, then sat down. The restaurant fell completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the ceiling fans and the distant traffic outside. Emily's heart beat so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she saw the face of her mother, smiling from the doorway as she practiced at home. She thought about her old dream, the one she had pushed aside for years. And then she began to play. At first, her fingers hesitated. The first few notes were soft, almost uncertain. But then the rhythm took over. The melody filled the room like a whisper that grew stronger with each breath. It was a slow, emotional piece, one she had written herself years ago when she still believed she could make it as a pianist. The crowd leaned in, completely still. The older man closed his eyes, listening. Even the servers stopped moving. The sound of her playing wrapped around the room like warm light, gentle, beautiful, and full of life. Charles sat frozen, his usual smirk fading slowly. For once, he didn't speak. When Emily finished, the last note hung in the air for what felt like forever. Then the silence broke, with applause. It started softly from one table, then spread throughout the entire restaurant. People stood clapping, some even cheering. The noise filled the space that had once been quiet. Emily stood up slowly, her hands still shaking. She didn't bow. She just smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. Charles clapped too, though his expression was complicated, somewhere between admiration and disbelief. When the applause faded, Tio. The sound of applause still echoed in Emily's mind long after that night ended. Even when the restaurant emptied out and the lights dimmed, she could still hear the clapping. That steady rhythm of hands that had broken the silence she'd carried for years. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. After the last guest left, her co-workers surrounded her with smiles and excitement. "I had no idea you could play like that," one of the servers said. "You were incredible, Emily." Another added. She tried to laugh it off, her cheeks warm. Wanted to prove something, I guess. Her manager approached, still looking a bit stunned. You didn't just prove something, he said with a smile. You gave everyone in that room something they'll remember. That was special. Emily smiled quietly. Thank you. When she finally left the restaurant that night, the city felt different. The air was cool, but the lights seemed warmer somehow. She walked slower than usual, as if she didn't want the feeling to fade too quickly. Her heart was still racing, not from fear or nerves, but from something else. Pride. For once, she had shared the part of herself she'd buried for so long. When she got home, her mother was still awake, sitting in the small living room reading. She looked up as soon as Emily walked in. You're late, she said softly, then noticed the expression on her daughter's face. Something happened, didn't it? Emily smiled, setting down her bag. You could say that. She told her everything, about how Charles had challenged her again, how she finally decided to play, and how the whole restaurant had gone silent. Her mother listened without interrupting, her eyes filling with quiet pride. When Emily finished, her mother reached out and took her hand. I told you, she said gently. Some things never leave you. Emily laughed softly. I guess you were right. That night she barely slept. Her phone buzzed constantly. Messages from co-workers, photos from the performance that someone had taken, even a few comments from customers who'd posted short clips online. She scrolled through them with disbelief. One video, shared by a diner, already had thousands of views and comments. People were calling her the Waitress pianist and praising her talent. At first, she felt shy about it. She wasn't used to attention. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. By the next evening, everyone at the restaurant was talking about it. Some customers even came in asking if the pianist Waitress would be playing again. The manager joked that they might have to start a new schedule just for her. When Charles Bennett arrived that night, Emily didn't know what to expect. Part of her wondered if he'd ignore her completely out of embarrassment. Another part of her feared he might make another joke to save face, but when he walked in, he wasn't laughing. He greeted her with a polite nod. Good evening, he said simply. Good evening, sir, Emily replied. When she served his table later, he spoke quietly, not in his usual loud, confident tone. You surprised me, he said. I didn't expect that. Emily smiled faintly. Most people don't. He paused, then nodded. That's fair. He didn't say much else after that, and for once, his table stayed calm and respectful all evening. After he left, the older man who had attended with him the previous night returned to the restaurant. He walked straight to Emily while she was wiping a table. You remember me, don't you? He asked with a warm smile. Of course, she said. You were here with Mr. Bennett. He nodded. Yes, my name's Henry. I used to manage events for the city's cultural center. He handed her a small business card. We're hosting a charity concert next month to raise funds for children's music programs. After hearing you play, I couldn't think of anyone better to open the evening. Emily froze, staring at the card. Me play? On stage? Henry smiled. Yes, you'd be the highlight. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just one or two pieces. We'd love to have you. For a moment, Emily couldn't find her voice. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Henry said kindly. You have something worth sharing. He left before she could answer, but his words echoed in her mind for the rest of the night. When she got home, she told her mother about the offer. Her mother's eyes lit up immediately. That's wonderful. You should do it. Emily hesitated. It's not that simple. I haven't played in front of people in years. What if I mess up? What if I'm not good enough anymore? Her mother shook her head firmly. You didn't look scared the other night. You looked free. Don't let fear take that away from you again. For the next few days, Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. Every spare moment she had, she sat at her piano practicing quietly. Her fingers stumbled at first, but gradually her confidence returned. She began playing longer pieces, revisiting old favorites, and experimenting with new melodies she had written but never shared. The restaurant remained busy, and the regular customers kept asking about her performance. Even strangers began to visit, curious to see the waitress who stunned the room. It felt surreal. Charles Bennett returned once more, this time alone. When Emily approached his table, he looked up and said, I owe you an apology. She blinked. For what? For underestimating you, he said simply, and for turning your job into a game. You didn't deserve that. Emily nodded slowly. Thank you. I appreciate that, he smiled faintly. I meant what I said about success, but I was wrong about how it's measured. You taught me that. There was a pause before he added. I heard you were invited to that charity event. I know the organizer. He said you haven't confirmed yet. I haven't decided, Emily admitted. Well, he said, standing up, if you go through with it, I'll be there. I think the world should hear you again. After he left, Emily stood there for a moment, stunned. She never imagined the man who once mocked her would become someone who encouraged her. Days passed quickly. Each evening after work, she practiced for hours. She chose 2 pieces, one classical and one she had written herself. Every note carried a story, every melody a piece of her past. Her mother sat nearby most nights, listening quietly, sometimes nodding along with closed eyes. Finally, the day of the concert arrived. It was held at a small but elegant hall near the city center. The lights were soft, the stage simple but beautiful. Emily wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back neatly. Her hands trembled slightly as she waited backstage. She peeked through the curtain and saw a crowd larger than she had expected. Familiar faces from the restaurant, her co-workers, even her manager. And in the front row sat her mother, smiling proudly. A few seats away was Charles Bennett, his usual confidence replaced by quiet admiration. When it was her turn, she stepped onto the stage. The lights felt bright at first, but as she sat at the piano and touched the keys, everything else faded away. She began with a soft, classical piece, one that flowed like water, delicate and calming. The audience listened in silence. Then she transitioned into her own composition, the same song she had played at the restaurant, but this time fuller, stronger, and filled with emotion. Halfway through, she forgot about fear. The music carried her completely. It was as if all the years she had spent hiding behind an apron and polite smiles had melted away. She wasn't a waitress anymore. She was a pianist again, not for fame or money, but because the music was who she truly was. When she finished, the hall erupted into applause. People stood, clapping and cheering. Emily looked out at the crowd, tears in her eyes. Her mother stood too, her face glowing with pride. Even Charles was clapping, his expression soft and genuine. Henry, the organizer, came up to her with a microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, let's give another round of applause for Emily Carter. A reminder that talent never fades, even when life takes us in other directions. The cheers grew louder. After the show, people crowded around to congratulate her. Henry told her that several local musicians wanted to collaborate, and a small recording studio had expressed interest in featuring her piece in an upcoming project. Charles approached her last, waiting until the crowd thinned. You did it, he said quietly. I knew you would. Emily smiled, her voice soft but steady. No, I just finally stopped hiding. He nodded, slipping an envelope into her hand. For your next piano, he said. Inside was a check, not a small one either. Consider it an investment in your future. She tried to refuse, but he shook his head. It's not a favor. It's respect. That night, as Emily and her mother walked home, the city lights shimmered above them. Her mother looked at her and said, I think this is just the beginning. Emily smiled, holding the card Henry had given her weeks ago. Maybe it is. She didn't know what the future would bring. Concerts, teaching, composing, maybe even performing full-time again. But one thing she knew for certain, she would never let her music go silent again. The shy waitress who once hid behind trays and polite smiles had found her voice, not through words, but through the notes that had always been waiting beneath her fingertips. And from that night forward, whenever she sat at a piano, she no longer played to prove herself to anyone else. She played because she finally believed in who she was. The morning after the charity concert, Emily woke up to a quiet apartment, sunlight spilling through the thin curtains. Her body ached slightly from nerves and excitement, but her heart felt light, almost as if a weight had been lifted. She stretched, taking a deep breath, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone hiding behind a life that wasn't hers. She walked to her piano, running her fingers over the keys. The sound echoed softly in the empty room, reminding her of last night. The applause, the smiles, the warm, encouraging faces. She could still feel the energy of the audience, how every note had traveled further than she imagined. Her mother came out of the bedroom with a cup of tea, smiling. You look like you didn't sleep a wink, she said. I didn't, Emily admitted, sitting down on the piano bench. But I feel alive. I feel like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be. Her mother sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. I've never doubted it for a second. You were always meant for music. You just needed the right moment to remember it. Emily smiled softly, closing her eyes. She thought about the path that had brought her here, the years of waiting tables, the sacrifices she'd made, and the quiet evenings spent at the piano when no one was watching. Every hardship, every small act of courage had led to this. By midday, Emily received a message on her phone. It was from Henry, the organizer of the charity concert. Emily, the feedback from last night has been incredible. People are still talking about your performance. I've already received several inquiries from other venues asking if you'd be willing to perform again. Let's meet and discuss the possibilities. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the message. She didn't realize how much she had wanted this until it was finally happening. Her mother peeked over her shoulder, seeing Emily's reaction. "They want you again," she said softly. "Do you feel ready?" Emily took a deep breath. "I think I do, but it's more than that. I want this. I want to play not just for others, but for me." That afternoon, she met Henry at a small cafe near the city center. He greeted her warmly and handed her a folder filled with proposals from local event organizers and small concert halls. "Look at this," he said. "They want you to perform at festivals, private events, even a few recordings. People are genuinely excited about your music." Emily flipped through the papers, her eyes widening. It was more than she had imagined possible. I don't know what to say," she said softly. "You don't have to say anything," Henry said kindly. "Just think about it. You have a gift, Emily. You've already proven that. Now it's time to share it." When she returned home that evening, Emily felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The reality of her new life, or at least the possibility of it, was starting to sink in. She sat at the piano, playing the pieces she had performed the night before. Each note was sharper, clearer, and more confident. She realized that practice and courage could carry her further than she ever imagined. Over the next few weeks, Emily's life began to change. She continued working at the restaurant, but now her days were filled with more than just serving tables. She met with local music teachers, rehearsed new pieces, and began planning performances at small venues. Word about her talent had spread quickly, a combination of the video from the restaurant going viral and the buzz from the charity concert. People were talking, inviting her to play and offering opportunities she never thought she'd receive. Her co-workers treated her differently now. They still respected her dedication to the restaurant, but they also looked at her with admiration. Some even teased her lightly, asking when she would bring her piano to the restaurant for another performance. Emily laughed politely, keeping her humility intact. She didn't want the attention to become the reason she played. Her music had to remain her own, pure and honest. One afternoon, while she was rehearsing a new piece, her phone buzzed again. It was a message from Charles Bennett. "Emily, I wanted to say congratulations. I've watched the video from your performance several times. You were incredible. I hope this is just the beginning." She stared at the message, a small smile forming on her lips. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The acknowledgement, the simple recognition from someone who had once doubted her, was enough. As the weeks passed, Emily started to perform at local venues. Each performance was a little different, some intimate, some more public. Every time she played, she noticed the way people reacted. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others whispered to their companions, clearly moved. Occasionally, a child in the audience would watch her intently, eyes wide with awe. Each response reminded Emily why she had returned to the piano, to touch people's lives in ways words could not. Even Charles Bennett returned once to see her perform at a small charity event. He didn't make a scene this time. He simply watched from the back of the room, his usual arrogance replaced with quiet respect. When she finished, he approached her and extended his hand. "Well done," he said simply. "You found your stage." Emily shook his hand, smiling. "Thank you," she said softly. "I think I finally understand what that means." It wasn't long before her name became known in the local music community. Teachers, event organizers, and musicians began reaching out, inviting her to collaborate or perform. She received small offers to record her compositions, and local radio stations began playing short clips of her music. It was a whirlwind, and at times it was overwhelming, but she embraced it slowly, taking care to maintain balance with her work at the restaurant and her personal life. Her mother remained her closest support. Each evening, after Emily returned home from rehearsals or performances, they would sit together sharing tea and talking about the day. Her mother never pressured her to take bigger opportunities or make quick decisions. She simply reminded Emily to trust herself, to let her heart guide her choices. One evening, as they sat together, her mother spoke quietly. "You've come so far, Emily. I remember when you thought you'd lost your music forever, and now look at you." Emily smiled, resting her hands in her lap. "I guess I needed someone to remind me it was still there," she said. Her mother nodded. "And you needed to remind yourself. Talent like yours doesn't disappear. It only waits for the right time to return." Emily realized that her journey wasn't just about music. It was about resilience, about rediscovering herself after years of doubt and sacrifice. Every performance, every note she played, was a reminder of her courage, of the risks she had taken, and the patience she had practiced. By the end of the month, Emily had performed at 3 more local events. Each time her confidence grew. She experimented with new compositions, blending classical training with her own emotional expression. Audiences responded with warmth and encouragement. She even began to teach a few young students, sharing her knowledge and passion with children who reminded her of herself at their age, eager, curious, and full of potential. One afternoon, while preparing for another small concert, Emily received a surprise visit at the restaurant. Charles Bennett walked in, this time without any friends. He approached her quietly, smiling. "I just wanted to see you," he said, "and to apologize properly. I was wrong to underestimate you, to make that bet too. Well, to treat you as if you were anything less than talented. You've proven me wrong in the best way possible." Emily smiled politely. "Thank you, sir. I don't hold it against you." That night, it changed everything. He nodded, clearly thoughtful. "It did, and it's reminded me that sometimes we overlook what we think is ordinary, but extraordinary often hides where we least expect it." Emily felt a warmth in her chest. "I've learned that too," she said softly. Before leaving, he handed her another envelope. "A little something to support your next piano project," he said. Emily opened it and found a generous contribution, enough to invest in better equipment, music sheets, and perhaps even a small home studio. I don't know what to say," she murmured, overwhelmed. "Say you'll keep playing," he said simply. "The world deserves to hear more of your music." That evening, Emily sat at her piano, reflecting on everything that had happened in the past few months. From the nervous waitress who had once been afraid to show her talent to the confident musician now performing in front of audiences and inspiring young students, her journey felt surreal. She closed her eyes and began to play, letting the music carry her. Every note told a story of hope, courage, rediscovery, and the unbreakable bond between dreams and perseverance. And in that moment, Emily realized something important. It wasn't about fame or money or even recognition. It was about finding herself again and sharing the beauty she carried inside. Her journey wasn't over, but she finally understood the power of her own voice, and she would never hide it again. The weeks following Emily's growing recognition were a whirlwind of excitement, nerves, and new experiences. Each day brought fresh invitations, private events, small concerts, and even a chance to record a few of her compositions. She was no longer just the shy waitress at Lakeside. She was Emily Carter, a musician whose talent had captured the attention of her community and beyond. Yet despite the attention and opportunities, Emily kept herself grounded. She continued working at the restaurant, serving tables and greeting familiar faces with her warm, quiet smile. It was part of her routine, part of the life she had built before anyone noticed the music that had always been a part of her. Her co-workers had grown to admire her, not only for her talent but also for the humility and kindness she carried with her. One Friday evening, the restaurant was particularly busy. The weekend crowd had arrived early, and the chatter and clinking of dishes filled the air. Emily moved gracefully between tables, taking orders and checking on her guests. The piano sat in its usual corner, silent but no longer a symbol of forgotten dreams. Now, it was a reminder of everything she had reclaimed. Charles Bennett appeared at the door again, as he often did these days. But this time he didn't come with his usual entourage. He greeted Emily with a quiet nod and found a table by himself. She approached with her usual calm, polite smile. "Good evening, sir," she said. "Good evening," he replied, his tone softer than before. "I wanted to hear you play again. Something tells me tonight is the night." Emily paused, considering. She had played for audiences at concerts and events, but the idea of performing in the restaurant again, for the casual diners and co-workers, felt strangely intimate. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. She finished her rounds, checked that all the tables were settled, and then walked toward the piano. Her fingers brushed the keys lightly, testing their feel. The familiar sensation was comforting, as though the instrument had been waiting patiently for her all this time. She glanced at the small crowd that had gathered near her. Curious diners, a few co-workers on break, and Charles, watching quietly from his table. As she began to play, the room fell silent. The music started softly, a delicate melody that filled the air like a gentle breeze. It was a piece she had written herself, inspired by her journey over the past few months, the doubts, the struggles, the courage it had taken to reclaim her music. Her hands moved gracefully across the keys, each note carrying emotion that words could not express. The diners leaned in, captivated, some closing their eyes as they listened. Her co-workers paused in their tasks, letting the music envelop the space around them. Even Charles, who had once mocked her for her quiet demeanor, sat in thoughtful silence, clearly moved. The melody shifted, growing stronger, more confident, echoing the transformation Emily had experienced. She remembered the nights she had spent alone at home, practicing, learning to trust her own abilities again. Every note was a declaration, a statement that she would never let fear or doubt hold her back again. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. The clapping was genuine, heartfelt, and it filled her with a warmth that made her eyes glisten. She rose from the piano slowly, bowing her head in gratitude. The applause continued, some standing, some smiling broadly, all recognizing the courage and skill behind the performance. Afterward, Charles approached her, clapping softly. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "I was wrong to underestimate you." Emily smiled faintly. "Thank you," she said. "I've learned a lot along the way." "It's more than talent," he added. "It's courage, persistence, and heart." People notice that even if they don't always say it. The compliment warmed her more than she expected. She nodded in acknowledgement, feeling the truth in his words. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about embracing who she was and letting the music speak for itself. That night, as Emily walked home, the city lights reflected on the wet streets, and the air was filled with the crisp scent of autumn. She carried her bag lightly over her shoulder, thinking about how far she had come. She had gone from a shy, overlooked waitress to a musician whose passion and talent were finally being recognized. Yet she felt no arrogance, no sense of being above anyone else. Instead, she felt grateful for the struggles that had shaped her, the people who had encouraged her, and the moments of courage that had allowed her to reclaim her music. The next morning, Emily received a call from Henry, the event organizer. "Emily," he said warmly, "the response to your performance at the restaurant has been remarkable. We've been offered the chance to host a larger event, and I'd love for you to headline it. Are you interested?" She paused, considering. The offer was bigger, more public, and yes, intimidating. But she felt ready. "Yes," she said finally. "I'll do it," Henry's voice brightened. "Fantastic. I knew you'd say yes. The world needs to hear your music." Over the next few weeks, Emily dedicated herself to preparation. She refined her compositions, experimented with new melodies, and even collaborated with a few local musicians who admired her work. Each rehearsal was a step toward confidence and mastery, a testament to the dedication that had carried her this far. Meanwhile, her life outside music remained balanced. She continued working at the restaurant, finding comfort in the familiar routines and the supportive co-workers who had witnessed her transformation. Each time she walked past the piano in the corner, she felt a quiet sense of pride. It was a reminder of the journey she had taken and the courage it had required to reclaim her dream. The night of the larger event arrived, and Emily stood backstage, her heart pounding. The hall was larger than any she had played before, filled with hundreds of seats and the bright glow of stage lights. The audience included families, music lovers, and even some faces she recognized from the restaurant. Her mother sat near the front, beaming with pride. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The crowd's applause was warm, welcoming, and reassuring. She sat at the grand piano, her fingers brushing the keys lightly. For a moment she closed her eyes, letting herself feel the energy of the audience, the memories of every struggle, every moment of practice, every night spent believing in herself. When she began to play, the music filled the hall. The melody was rich, emotive, and alive, carrying the story of her journey. It was music that spoke of hope, courage, and transformation. The audience listened, captivated, some with tears glistening in their eyes. Every note seemed to resonate with the hearts of those who heard it, connecting her story to their own experiences of perseverance and passion. As she transitioned into her own composition, the energy in the hall grew. The music soared, building in intensity and emotion, a reflection of her journey from the timid waitress to the confident musician she had become. She felt every note, every chord, flowing through her as if the piano itself had become a part of her being. When the final note faded into silence, the audience erupted into applause, cheers, and standing ovations. Emily rose from the piano, overwhelmed by the response, tears streaming down her face. She bowed deeply, acknowledging the recognition, not for herself alone, but for the journey she had undertaken and the people who had supported her along the way. After the performance, people crowded around to congratulate her. Henry approached, smiling broadly. "Emily, that was incredible. You've inspired so many tonight." She shook her head, her voice shaking. "I didn't do it for that. I did it because I had to. Because it was time to be myself again." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "And that's exactly why it resonated. People felt your honesty, your courage. That's what makes music unforgettable." Even Charles Bennett was there, standing quietly in the back. When he approached her, he simply said, "You've changed lives tonight, Emily. You've certainly changed mine." Emily smiled softly. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Over the following months, Emily's life settled into a new rhythm. She continued performing at events, composing her own music, and teaching a few students who reminded her of the eager, curious child she had once been. The restaurant remained her anchor, a place where she could remain grounded and connected to the life she had lived before her music took flight. Through it all, she learned that talent alone was not enough. It was courage, persistence, and the willingness to take a step into the unknown that had made the difference. She had been overlooked, doubted, and underestimated, but she had never given up on herself. And now, she had reclaimed her music, her confidence, and her voice. One quiet evening after a small performance at a local venue, Emily returned home. She sat at her piano, playing softly, letting the music fill the room. She thought about the journey she had taken, from the shy, overlooked waitress to the confident musician sharing her gift with the world. She thought about the people who had supported her, encouraged her, and believed in her even when she struggled to believe in herself. And as she played, she realized that the music was more than just sound. It was a reflection of her heart, her courage, and her journey. It was a reminder that no matter how long it takes, dreams can be reclaimed and voices that are quieted can rise stronger than ever. Emily smiled, her fingers dancing over the keys. She had found her place, her purpose, and her voice, and she knew, deep in her heart, that the music would never be silent again.